I'll push the shutter blades open. What's holding me? Oh, that lever, of course. I'll just hold that back out the way. Push the blades fully open. That'll allow us the B lever to drop down into its rest position, as it would do when the shutter has been held open on B. And then I can fit the spring. Now the spring is not easy to get in position because of the shape of it. Everything gets in the way. I've got to get that screw started in there. Okay, I've got the screw started. Now I can swing that spring around. It'll come right round the inside of that lens tube there, and it tucks down into the back of the B lever. That's sitting good. I'll just tighten that screw down lightly, check that that's moving correctly. If the B lever comes off its post, it could end up trapped under the screw instead of being around the shoulder of the screw, but that's working correctly there. So I hold that back with my finger. I can bring the shutter blades back to the closed position. That's that part dealt with. Now these components in here for the flash sink need to be dealt to. Now these parts I haven't cleaned yet, and I'm going to have to clean them because inexplicably the little pallet wheel here is covered in some thick grease. I've said that the lubrication on this shutter is generally very deficient, but somebody has put quite a big blob of grease on here on that pallet wheel and this little sector gear, and all of that's going to have to come off. That pallet would not revolve with all that muck on it. It wouldn't revolve at the speed it's meant to revolve at. So I'll clean that and then we'll put it in place. Right, so the pallet wheel is clean. I'll drop that into place on its shaft. Check that it revolves smoothly, that the pallets rattle backwards and forwards as they should. Now the little sector gear that drives that, is it catches behind, there's a little tab on the end of that lever, catches behind part of the mechanism. It needs to latch into position. So I just put a smear of molybdenum paste on that little tab so that it does in fact latch easily into place. And I'll swing this arm down, and then I've got to fit the spring. It has to hook over that post, be stretched out and hooked into that arm, so that when the shutter's cocked, the action for the flash sink is cocked, and as the shutter starts to fire, the first thing that happens is that that flash sink runs down, even before the blades start opening really. And that's to actually fire the flash before the shutter opens. That's so that bulb flash takes a certain amount of time to actually start burning at peak brilliance. So there's an advantage in actually firing the flash bulb before the shutter blades reach peak opening. Unlike electronic flash, which is for all practical purposes instantaneous. You have that firing at the point the blades are fully opened. Well, that part went very well, so I can start cleaning and reassembling the rest of that flash sink mechanism. I'll do that off camera, you can watch me assemble it. Before I put the flash sink stuff in, I've got to put my flash sink settings lever and so forth back in place. Now this is very twisted. Some clown has got onto that lever and given it an extra good twist. Why? Well, we'll never know. I'll see if I can straighten it up. That's got quite a twist. It's not only twisted clockwise here, it's also bent. It's bent directly that way. Yeah, it's not good. I'm going to try another pair of pliers. I don't want to scar that up. That's okay in that direction. About this direction. That's a bit better. Right, yeah, just how that came to be like that is anyone's guess. It's not unusual if there's a problem with the camera or someone feels there's a problem with the shutter. It's not uncommon for people to start pushing and shoving at every available lever in the belief that somehow they will clear the blockage. Like, I don't know, it's like they're unplugging a sink or something. People just have weird ideas that if they push hard enough it will clear the blockage and things will work. Get that lever in position. This shim goes on here. I think it's just human nature to push and pull at any available lever without any regard to what the function of the lever might be and whether or not it can possibly have any beneficial effect. I think it's just something we're hardwired to do. That screw doesn't want to start. That's better. I'll have to check that lever quite closely to make sure it hasn't been bent either, otherwise it would impart undue friction to the diaphragm setting, and it may not. Yeah, that's stiff. We know the diaphragm's not stiff, so that lever's probably bent. Again, that would have probably been bent at the same time somebody was busy abusing that. I'll get it fitted in place with the 3 screws and see if I can see at which point it's bent. It means it's out of flat. It's not flat, so when it's held down to the case by the 3 screws, it's being held tight against the case at some point because of the bend in it. It is quite stiff. I'm seeing if I can tell where that bend is. If I loosen off one of the screws, that might tell me. Okay, that's working better there. That suggests that I can see that it's bent here. There's a curve here. This is raised at this point. If I tighten the screw down at that point, the maximum point where it's raised, and then force that ring up slightly around here, it may bend that ring back the other way. Let's try that. Certainly didn't help. What's the other side look like? Oh yeah, it's anything but flat, this thing. Yeah, this can be a challenge to get this right. Basically we're trying to take the buckle out of that flat ring. Yes. Oh yeah. Alright, I'll be back in 5 minutes when I've got this running smoothly. Well, I had to take that off and do a bit of work straightening it out. It was only very subtly out of flat, but it certainly was out of flat, and there was a rough spot on there somewhere. And you see that moves quite freely now. There's no problem there at all. Even though the screws are all tight, it's just running exactly as it should. This piece, of course, has to couple to the shutter speed setting ring so that it moves the aperture setting as you move that dial. And you only separate this from the shutter setting ring when you're changing the exposure value. Anyway, that's all good. I can get this flash contact stuff back in place now, which is what I was going to do before I was so rudely interrupted. Normally I just put a wipe of molybdenum paste through the centre of this spring-loaded lever, and that sits on here. Now, interestingly, there's a flash contact here on the case that's flattened back against the case. It should have a bit of a kick on it. It should stick out from there, otherwise the flash contact may not make correctly. Put the moving flash contact in position. Now, if I set that mechanism in the cocked position, I should be able to fit the lever on the top. And at this end, fluff on that, no way. The spring goes on here, and that's held in place with this screw, which has a shoulder on it that the spring must be free to rotate around. Just checking that the spring is seated around the shoulder. It is, not trapped underneath, otherwise it won't work correctly. And the spring needs to be swung over onto this side of the arm, lifted over the top, tucks down into a tiny groove at the back of that arm, and now this arm is sprung loaded. That arm's job is to latch the main cam in position. And I'm just looking at that, I suspect excuse me, that is not the shape, or is it? That doesn't look like the shape of a late Retina IIIC arm. I think they've got a rounded tip on them more. Never mind, that'll certainly do the job. But again, it's just more indication that these cameras were built up out of spares, and the spare parts weren't necessarily spare parts for the last of the Retina IIIC generation. They may have been parts from earlier cameras. What's next? Oh, your shutter release lever. That shutter release lever with its funny bent up spring that was tucked round the back of the housing. How should that have looked? Right, let's have a look. I'll zoom you in a little bit. So here we have it. This is the lever as found in the camera. This spring at this end has been bent, it's been bent specifically in that odd direction. This is how the shutter lever should have looked, with the spring looking like that. The spring here would fit against the case on this side of the train. The lever as fitted to the camera, that spring was swung right over and was fitted on this side of that lever. So that was a habit that was made with the Retina reflex models, because they had, particularly the S, they had greater amount of levers, if you like, in the shutter release, and it was just to make sure that everything unhooked correctly when the shutter was released. So, but this was odd. This is not something I've seen in a production camera. That spring's certainly been bent intentionally. I'm sure it'll work, and I'm going to put it back in place exactly as I found it, just because that's a historical oddity, and it's not my camera. It's not for me to start improving things. That lever sits in here. Must go underneath the B lever, of course. And its spring, in this case, needs to be pushed right the way across the top there. Yeah, it's a fight. No, must have been a bugger to assemble it like this. That's it. It's in place. It's firm. I would say it's firmer than the shutter release would normally be. I don't know that that's any disadvantage in that. Basically, when you press the shutter release, it lifts this arm here, which swings it in at this end, which would release the main cam, amongst other actions. So that's that. We'll leave that exactly as it is. Next in the shutter, of course, we have our main drive cam, which again is well greased, but the grease has died. It's gone hard. And its spring. Now the spring normally is greased or lubricated, at least to some extent. This one's completely dry. So again, a bit of a mixture of lubrication there. And off camera, I'll clean these bits and bring you back. I'll put the main drive cam back in the shutter now. First I need to lubricate that lightly with some molybdenum paste. That curved surface in particular, that's where it runs up against the end of the retard gear train. There are two surfaces where it picks up the blade actuating ring, and usually I just give it a quick wipe through the inside to make sure that it has no undue friction on its post. Just drop that into place in the shutter, rotate that round to the rest position. It's the main drive spring here. Normally I would just give that a quick wipe on the inside of the surface with some molybdenum paste, very little indeed. It was not uncommon for this to be completely smothered in graphite grease. I'm not convinced that that really did anything particularly useful. Now get that seated correctly. This will be a fight to get the spring into position, probably, because it's it'll be so tight compared to the normal, very relaxed, tired springs that I'm normally fitting. Alright, let's see if I can pick up the end of this spring and carry it over the top. No, it's already coming unseated. One end of the spring sits down into a hole in the blade, the retard, the main drive cam, and I've got to get this other end lifted up and over the top of this bracket and tucked down behind it. There we go, it's done. Right, so when the shutter's cocked, first this part's cocked, then this part is cocked, and when you press the release, bang, everything happens. So a little bit of molybdenum paste here on this lever so that the main drive cam will latch behind it smoothly. Because that spring has got more tension than most of them will see, because they're too old and tired, it means it'll put more load on the shutter cocking rack, and the shutter cocking rack is under more stress. So we need to make sure that everything works as smoothly as possible. Otherwise something will go bung. We don't want that. And the next thing will be the retard gear train and the self-timer or delay action. And if you can hear that buzzing sound in the background, that's them in the ultrasonic cleaner at the moment. Back shortly. Okay, I've got my two gear trains cleaned and lubricated with graphite powder in this case, which is what I typically do. Just get this one seated correctly in place. This is the retard gear train. Getting that seated, making sure that this tab is pulled back so it's not sitting on top of the tab on the blade actuating ring, but sitting behind it. That tab on the blade actuating ring pulls this lever back, disengaging the pallets until they're required. Alright, so that certainly works and runs down. That was probably at something close to maximum engagement. We'll check the timing of that shortly. Now the self-timer or the delay action goes on over here. It's got to be seated correctly. It's got to sit correctly in the body at this point. That's better. Otherwise it will not run properly if it's sitting up. Check that that runs down. That sounds very good. Just tighten that screw up. Check the other two screws, they're great. I'll just blow those out in case there was any residual graphite powder there. And it's run that self-timer right through. So I'll cock the shutter, set the self-timer, release the shutter, and the self-timer should run down. No, it didn't. What was that? Oh, that lever wasn't pulled over by its spring. I'll hold that manually. That's better. There. Now fire that. That's better. Still didn't do it. Interesting. I'll find out what's going on there. Well, a bit of investigation later, and it appears that the main drive spring is sufficiently lively that without the spring stopping the self-timer from being pushed out of the way, the lock from being pushed out of the way, it would simply push it out of the way. But when everything was correctly positioned, it works correctly. The self-timer is working fine. So there was no problem there, but certainly it just shows that what you can get away with a tired old shutter, you won't get away with a new shiny shutter with all its proper strength and in the springs. So that's good to know. So what I'll do is I'll lubricate these three components, which is our pinion here. The pinion here was somewhat smothered in grease previously, and really it doesn't need any of that. I just put a very small smear on the shaft just so that it's rotating freely It doesn't require any on the teeth or anywhere else for that matter. The internal cocking ring, this piece here, I just put a white round the inside and a white round the outside edge, including the gear teeth there. That's all that's required. And this can be put into position, get that spring seated on its post. Rotate this into position so that it's correctly engaged. I'll bring you in closer, that's close enough. The teeth here. Have a close look at the teeth here. The last tooth on the pinion engages with the first groove in the curved rack. And then we have the shutter speed settings cam plate. Normally I just wipe once around here, again with molybdenum paste, once around there. And that is all that's required. Typically these are quite greasy. They don't need to be greased up like that. And if I set it to this position, this should be an 1/8 of a second. If everything is set correctly, let's see what it sounds like. That sounds fairly credible. It might be slightly fast. I'll check the 15th. Slightly fast. I'm just going to adjust this to slow it down just slightly, and then I'll go and test it on my shutter speed tester and I'll come back.